What if I told you that the worst nightmare in the history of seafaring did not happen on the raging ocean, but on solid ground? The story of the ship Batavia is not just a tale of a shipwreck, it is a chronicle of how quickly a civilized person loses their humanity. As soon as a servant grew old, lost strength, or fell ill, the mechanism of the luxurious household ruthlessly rejected them as an unnecessary detail. These people, who had served one family for decades, found themselves on the doorstep of their home with a small rag bag and a complete lack of prospects. Their fates rarely made it into the newspapers and were almost never recorded in family chronicles. Victorian society preferred to ignore those who, having devoted their best years to the well-being of others, found themselves on the brink of ruin. For their employers, these servants ceased to be people and became a problem that had to be solved quickly, quietly, and at minimal cost. It was not just a matter of losing a job, but of completely losing one's social status and often the roof over one's head. They faced a cruel choice: beggars' hospitals where there was neither treatment nor care, gloomy workhouses where labor continued until the last breath, or complete obscurity in the cold of the street. Even those who had a small amount of accumulated capital quickly lost it trying to pay their bills or find some kind of acceptable housing. It was a tragic irony of an era when the prosperity of the few was built on the absolute insecurity of the many. Thus, the Victorian mansion, which seemed a symbol of stability and order, was in fact a machine that ground lives to dust. This machine ran smoothly until its fuel, the health and youth of the servants, ran out. But what exactly was the final chord in this invisible tragedy? And who reached out a helping hand when all doors were closed? Watch the video to the end to find out how the modest legacy of one old governess sparked a movement that temporarily changed attitudes toward elderly servants. What if I told you that everything you believed in was a lie? The Victorian mansion, which for most people was a symbol of prosperity and unshakable traditions, was in fact a two-sided mirror. One side reflected the luxury, dinners, balls, and carefree life of the owners, while the other reflected the exhausting, hopeless labor of the servants who worked almost around the clock. These two realities existed simultaneously, without intersecting, but one was impossible without the other. Behind the impeccable facade lay a constant threat to the health and lives of those who maintained it. Imagine a world where there is no paid sick leave and a maid's working day begins at 5 in the morning and ends well after midnight. This was the rhythm of life for thousands of servants whose injuries and illnesses accumulated over the years until they became a death sentence. Constant hypothermia, contact with corrosive cleaning products, heavy lifting, and sleeping in damp cubicles. All this was the price of maintaining the comfort of their masters. The masters, as a rule, viewed their servants' ailments not as a consequence of working conditions, but as a sign of laziness or, worse, moral laxity. When a servant fell ill, the attitude towards them changed instantly and dramatically. If the illness was temporary, the servant might be allowed to rest for a day or two, but their duties would fall on the shoulders of others, causing natural discontent. However, if the illness dragged on, or, worst of all, proved to be contagious, the owners showed impatience bordering on disgust. Infection of family members through a sick servant was considered an unacceptable risk. Thus, illness or old age became not only a personal tragedy for the servant, but also a serious disruption of the order in the house. This problem had to be eliminated so as not to disrupt the well-established mechanism that had been honed over the years. Dismissal due to illness was the simplest and most logical solution from the employer's point of view, and it was practically not subject to public condemnation. In the Victorian era, a person who was unable to work automatically dropped out of the social system and became invisible. Losing one's job meant immediate eviction. Servants lived in small rooms provided by their employer and did not own any property. Their wages, which were often small and irregular, did not allow them to save for a rainy day. As a result, a sick or elderly servant would find themselves literally on the street, deprived not only of income, but also of minimal shelter. This was the real dark side of Victorian prosperity. The most striking thing is that servants often accepted this logic themselves, believing that since they could not do their job, they had no right to occupy a place in the house. Centuries of subjugation and lack of personal rights had shaped a particular psychology. They perceived dismissal as an inevitable consequence of their physical defect. This absolute dependence made their position completely powerless. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that finding a new job at the age of 40 or 50 was incredibly difficult. Employers preferred young, energetic servants who could work tirelessly. Therefore, dismissal due to old age or chronic illness often became a final sentence. No one wanted to take responsibility for someone's uncertain future. Many of them worked for the same family for decades, often putting not only their strength, but also their sincere devotion into their work. They raised children, cared for the sick, and were the keepers of family secrets. However, when their own time of need came, all that devotion evaporated like morning fog. Duty and affection turned out to be one-sided. This gave rise to a unique form of fear that was a constant companion in the life of every servant. It was not just the fear of losing one's job, but the fear of being forgotten, discarded, completely alone and helpless. This fear was a much stronger motivator than any carrot or stick. It forced people to work through pain, hide their fatigue, and not complain. Do you agree with this? Please tell us what you think about such one-sided loyalty to masters. Every opinion is valuable. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Are you ready to learn the truth about what really happened to the servants? The dismissal of a sick or elderly servant was never sudden. It was always preceded by a series of warning signs that made it clear that their time in the house was coming to an end. Servants, being sensitive and observant people, quickly picked up on these changes in the atmosphere and behavior of their employers and senior servants. This was a time when every mistake or delay in work could be fatal. The first and most obvious sign was the growing dissatisfaction of the housekeeper or butler. They began to nitpick and publicly criticize the quality of work, even though they had previously turned a blind eye to minor flaws. The sick servant was given the most difficult and thankless tasks, which required the greatest physical effort, as if to test his endurance. The increased workload was a kind of aptitude test that was obviously impossible to pass. The second sign was a reduction in contact with the owners. Whereas previously a servant, especially one from the upper echelons, could exchange a few words with their masters, now such encounters were reduced to a curt order or complete disregard. The owners, not wanting to feel guilty about the impending dismissal, began to distance themselves from the person they were about to throw out. It was a kind of emotional preparation for parting. The reasons for final dismissal were usually chronic illnesses that were a direct consequence of working conditions. Rheumatism, caused by working in cold rooms and constant contact with water, was one of the most common ailments. Constant joint pain made it impossible to work quickly and efficiently, especially for maids, who had to constantly go up and down stairs. Another common cause was vision problems. Long hours of working in dim light, especially for seamstresses and footmen responsible for polishing silver, inevitably led to deteriorating eyesight. A servant with poor eyesight could easily damage expensive tableware or make a mistake, which was sufficient grounds for dismissal. Employers did not want servants who caused material damage to the house. Age itself was also a sentence. Even if an old servant was healthy, he was slower and less energetic than a young one. Housekeepers and butlers, interested in maximum efficiency, always sought to replace older workers with younger, and importantly, cheaper staff. In this cruel world, there was no room for sentimentality or respect for the past. Often, dismissal was disguised as a demotion or transfer to lighter work. A servant might be offered the position of gatekeeper or handyman, but the salary would be meager and the working conditions humiliating. It was a psychological trick to make the servant resign of their own accord, thereby relieving the owners of responsibility. Ultimately, the announcement of dismissal was made dryly and without unnecessary emotion, often through the butler or housekeeper rather than by the master himself. The servant was given 1 or 2 days to pack their belongings and was paid a small amount as severance pay, which was called a monthly salary. This was extremely little to start a new life. Servants who lost their jobs often tried to find work in less prestigious households or become day laborers, but their age and poor health hindered these attempts. They fell into a vicious circle where the lack of work exacerbated their situation, and their poor situation made it impossible to find work. It was a real social trap. For servants who fell ill, old age was the worst sentence. What do you think was the most difficult thing for a dismissed servant? Physical pain or the loss of their place in the world? Watch the video to the end to find out what happened next. I will reveal the best-kept secret of the Victorian charity movement. Against a backdrop of widespread cruelty and indifference to the fate of elderly servants, a unique charity movement emerged in Victorian England that sought to create more humane conditions for them. These were the so-called homes for aged servants. These institutions were a rare exception to the general rule of indifference, but their number was negligible compared to the real need. Created through private donations and charitable contributions, these homes were small oases of hope. Unlike the gloomy workhouses, where hard labor and humiliation reigned, these homes sought to provide their residents with a minimum of comfort and respect for their past. Old servants could get a small private room, hot meals, and most importantly, the company of their peers. It was a place where their years of hard work and dedication were finally recognized and appreciated, albeit too late. The selection criteria were very strict, making it a real lottery to get in. Applicants had to have an impeccable reputation, confirmed by letters of recommendation from former employers. A minimum length of service was required, sometimes up to 20 or 30 years in respected families. In fact, only the best of the best, the most deserving servants, had a chance at a peaceful old age. At the same time, the homes existed on very modest means, and the number of places was limited. Dozens, even hundreds, of unfortunate people could apply for one place in such a home. Servants who managed to get a place felt like real lucky ones who had been given a second chance in life. It was a salvation from poverty and the humiliation of a workhouse. Among such homes, the Home for Elderly Governesses, or Home for Servants in Surrey, stood out, which was founded on an inheritance or a large donation from a former mistress. These homes created an atmosphere as close to home as possible, with shared living rooms, libraries, and regular tea parties. In such an environment, old servants could feel like respected people for the first time in many years, rather than service personnel. However, there was also a downside to this charity. Employers, knowing about the existence of such homes, could dismiss old servants with a clear conscience, believing that good people will take care of them. Thus, charity, unable to cope with the flow of people in need, unwittingly gave free rein to cruel employers. It became an easy way to evade moral responsibility. The irony was that even within the walls of these homes, the strict rules characteristic of the Victorian era prevailed. Residents had to follow a strict daily routine, rules of conduct, and regularly attend church services. Respect and comfort were not given to them for free, but in exchange for complete obedience and humility. Freedom from labor did not mean freedom from moralizing. These homes were living proof that Victorian society could not completely ignore the problem of old servants, but at the same time did not want to solve it at the state level. They were a kind of crutch for a broken social system. They saved a few, but could not change the fate of thousands. This fate was the best option for a dismissed servant. Do you think these were rare examples of true kindness, or a way for Victorian society to ease its conscience? Please like this video if you think such charity was necessary. What you are about to learn will change your perception of Victorian society. For the vast majority of dismissed, sick, or elderly servants, the workhouse was their final refuge, and it was a truly horrific end. The workhouse was not just a shelter, but an institution designed to provide a minimum existence in exchange for hard, humiliating labor. Its purpose was not to save the poor, but to keep them off the streets and teach them order and discipline. One could only enter a workhouse after undergoing a humiliating procedure. The newcomer had to completely renounce his property, undergo a medical examination, and change his clothes for a government uniform. This was a symbolic act, signifying the loss not only of property, but also of personal identity and dignity. From a servant, albeit a dismissed one, a person was transformed into a faceless pauper with no rights. Living conditions inside the workhouse were deliberately harsh in order to discourage the poor from staying there. Food was scarce and monotonous, consisting mainly of oatmeal, bread, and cheese. People slept in communal, poorly heated rooms on hard beds, which was especially painful for the elderly and sick. There was no respect for personal life or past there. The daily routine was strictly regulated and began long before dawn. Residents, regardless of age and health, were required to perform hard physical labor. The most common tasks were dismantling old ropes, crushing stones, or grinding bones. This work was meaningless but exhausting, and its purpose was to punish rather than to be of any real benefit. Old servants accustomed to working in a clean house found the dirt and rough labor of the workhouse particularly difficult to bear. Their sore joints and weakened eyesight made them ineffective workers. The workhouse administration made no allowances for age or past merits, demanding that quotas be met under threat of punishment or reduced rations. The worst thing was the separation of families. In the workhouse, spouses, even the very elderly, were separated and placed in different buildings, and visits were allowed only rarely and under strict supervision. For servants who were often single, this did not matter much, but it emphasized the total devaluation of human relationships. The labor camp was designed to destroy all private life. Medical care in workhouses was minimal. Doctors visited rarely, medicines were very basic, and hygiene was poor. Diseases spread quickly, and for elderly servants whose immune systems were weakened, the workhouse often became their final resting place. The attitude towards the sick was indifferent and inhumane. Workhouses were run by so-called boards of trustees, which often consisted of wealthy and influential people. They believed that a harsh regime was the best way to combat self-inflicted poverty. In their eyes, a servant who lived to old age in poverty was himself to blame for his fate. Because of these terrible conditions, many dismissed servants preferred to wander, beg, or seek any other means of survival rather than end up in a workhouse. The workhouse was the last line they hoped never to cross. It was synonymous with complete ruin and the end of human life. The workhouse was a tragic outcome for most. Ready to find out how society reacted to the fate of these people? Most servants in the Victorian era had no savings, but those who worked in high positions, such as butlers or governesses, could sometimes accumulate a small amount. However, these savings were extremely unreliable and could not provide them with a comfortable old age. The era did not have state pension systems, and any attempt to set aside money depended on the honesty of the employer or luck. Servants often entrusted their savings to their employers, who promised to keep them safe or invest them. This was a naive but common solution based on years of loyalty and trust. However, when a servant fell ill or was dismissed, this money could disappear. Employers could claim that the investments had failed or that the accumulated amount had been spent entirely on medical treatment. It was impossible to prove anything. Another way to save money was through savings banks, but they were not widely available and were often subject to financial turmoil. Many servants lacking financial literacy fell victim to fraudsters or lost money due to bank failures. The loss of all savings in an instant was a common and sudden tragedy. Pensions, as we understand them today, did not exist. Sometimes, as a sign of special favor or gratitude for long years of service, employers would promise a former servant an annual allowance. This allowance was tiny, but it could be a lifesaver. However, such a promise was legally meaningless and depended entirely on the goodwill and financial situation of the family. The death of the master who promised the allowance often meant the end of these payments. Heirs who felt no personal attachment to the old servant easily refused to pay non-essential expenses. They believed that their duty was to take care of their own well-being, not someone else's old age. The former servant was left with nothing. Even if the money was preserved, It was quickly eaten away by inflation or the need to pay for housing and medical treatment. The cost of medical services was high, and chronic diseases required constant expenses. What seemed like a significant amount at the age of 20 became a tiny stream in old age, which was only enough for a few months. As a result, even the most prudent and thrifty servants had no guarantee of a peaceful old age. Their financial future was hostage to the honesty, mercy, and luck of others. This total insecurity was part of a system built on the employer's complete control over the employee's life. The only real pension was the hope that the servant's children, if he had any, would take him in. But even this was often impossible, as the children themselves were likely to be working as servants and could not afford to support their infirm parent. They were faced with a cruel choice between loyalty to duty and their own survival. The unreliability of the financial system and the lack of social guarantees made old age a real test of endurance for servants. It was not savings, but only God's mercy that could give them hope. I discovered this by accident. When all other avenues were closed, old and sick servants, if they were not lucky enough to end up in a workhouse, ended up in hospitals for the poor, or so-called charity hospitals. These institutions, like workhouses, were the last resort and, in essence, only a postponement of the inevitable. They offered not so much treatment as shelter and the opportunity to die off the streets. Hospitals for the poor existed on charitable donations and were catastrophically overcrowded. Patients lay in huge, poorly ventilated wards where a wide variety of ailments, from fractures to chronic diseases, were mixed together. Hygiene was poor, and the staff, consisting of a small number of doctors and volunteers, was overworked. The attitude towards patients was strictly hierarchical. Patients who paid for their treatment, even with small amounts of money, received better conditions and attention. The poor, including old servants, were seen as a necessary but burdensome obligation. Their treatment was mainly carried out by young, inexperienced medical students who were gaining experience. Treatment, if it was provided at all, was primitive and often ineffective. Victorian medicine did not yet know antibiotics and many modern methods. And for chronic diseases such as rheumatism or tuberculosis, the hospital was only a place of observation, not healing. Often the only treatment was to provide rest and minimal nutrition. Old servants, accustomed to cleanliness and order in mansions, found it difficult to tolerate the chaos and unsanitary conditions that prevailed in hospitals. They were forced to share wards with vagrants and beggars, and their former, albeit humiliating status in a wealthy household, now seemed like luxury. Respect for their past life disappeared completely. The length of stay in the hospital was strictly limited. As soon as a patient no longer needed immediate care or their condition stabilized, they were discharged, even if they were not completely healthy and had no place to live. The hospital could not afford to keep chronically ill patients who occupied precious beds. Discharge meant a return to the old problems: poverty, unemployment, and homelessness. A person leaving the hospital was weak and hardly able to start a new life. They were again faced with a choice: a workhouse or the street. The hospital only postponed the end. Some servants who had a small income tried until the last moment not to go to hospitals for the poor, preferring to pay private doctors or be treated at home as long as their funds allowed. They feared ending up in this institution more than the disease itself, knowing that it would be the end of their social existence. Getting there was a sign of complete failure in life. Thus, the hospital for the poor was a kind of purgatory. It was the last stage before complete oblivion, offering a minimal chance of survival, but taking away the last shred of dignity. It was the bitterest irony that the people who maintained health and cleanliness in the richest homes died themselves in filth and oblivion. The hospital was an inevitable step. What do you think was worse, ending up in a poorhouse or on the street? In the next chapter, we will talk about life on the street and what happened next. For many dismissed servants who could not find work and avoided workhouses at all costs, the only option was the street. Losing one's job meant not only a loss of income, but a complete break with one's usual way of life. People who had lived according to a strict routine for decades suddenly found themselves on their own. They had no savings, no connections, and no skills for survival. The street became the last and most frightening choice. Vagrancy in Victorian London was an extremely dangerous and harsh way of life. The city was overflowing with poor people, and every inch of space already had its inhabitants. Newcomers were met with hostility and sometimes violence. The elderly and sick, who had no experience of life outside the walls of a mansion, found themselves completely unprepared for this struggle for survival. They faced cold, hunger, and constant threats from the police. Any arrest could result in imprisonment or being sent to a workhouse. The police often did not understand the causes of poverty and acted harshly. For former servants, this was especially humiliating. Fear of authority accompanied them every day. Former servants tried to earn a living by any means available. They clung to any opportunity that did not require hard physical labor. Many hoped to survive by doing odd jobs, but reality quickly shattered these hopes. There was a catastrophic shortage of money, even for bread. The old footmen could beg for alms at the doors of theaters or churches, using their once respectable appearance. They tried to stand up straight and speak politely, as they had become accustomed to doing during their years of service. Sometimes this aroused sympathy in passers-by, but more often than not, people walked by, unwilling to notice the misfortune of others. Pride prevented them from begging too insistently. Maids could try to sell matches, flowers, or provide small services for a few pennies. They cleaned, carried water, or helped in the markets. However, their age and poor health prevented them from competing with younger and stronger beggars. The work went to those who were more resilient. Former maids quickly lost their last strength. They tried to stay away from the city center, where the police were particularly vigilant. Central areas were considered dangerous for the homeless. Any gathering of poor people there was dispersed. Therefore, former servants went to the outskirts. It was quieter there, but help was almost non-existent. They sought shelter in doorways, markets, or under bridges. These places were dirty and damp. Often other vagrants already lived there, and they were not always friendly. They had to share space and endure insults. It was almost impossible to sleep peacefully. Sleeping on the street, especially in the rainy and cold months, was a direct path to pneumonia and quick death. Their clothes did not have time to dry, and their shoes fell apart. Colds quickly turned into serious illnesses. There was nowhere to get treatment and no money for it. Every night could be their last. Every night was a test that drained the last of their strength. People woke up exhausted and hungry. With each passing day, it became more difficult to move and search for food. Sleep brought no rest. It only briefly dulled the pain and fear. Many of them kept the remnants of their former clothing. These items were the only reminder of their former lives. Old but once high-quality uniforms could temporarily set them apart from the general mass of vagrants. Sometimes it aroused pity, but more often it attracted unwanted attention. Such clothing made them targets for thieves and swindlers. Liveries and dresses were considered valuable because of their fabric and buttons. Former servants could be robbed or beaten at night. Their tattered clothes became a symbol of their downfall. They were a reminder of who these people used to be. Tattered liveries and dresses were a bitter reminder of their past lives. They had once walked the same streets, but as servants to wealthy masters. Now they were unwanted. These people seemed stuck between the past and the present. They were ghosts of Victorian luxury. For women, especially maids and cooks, life on the streets was particularly dangerous. They faced constant threats from men. Any attempt to resist could lead to brutal violence. Women lived in constant fear. There were almost no safe places for them. They tried to stick together in small groups to protect each other in some way. Sometimes they shared food and shelter, but even that did not guarantee complete safety. The streets showed no mercy to the weak. Any mistake could cost them their lives. Former servants rarely joined forces with professional beggars. Their past, filled with strictness and order, prevented them from accepting the rules of the street. They did not know how to steal and did not want to break the law. The criminal lifestyle was alien to them. This made them even more vulnerable. They remained loners, isolated from the society they had served and from the world into which they had been thrown. They had no place in either of these worlds. They felt they belonged to no one. This intensified their sense of loneliness. They were strangers everywhere. The only help they could get was random acts of kindness. Sometimes former colleagues would recognize them on the street. Such encounters were painful and awkward. Someone might give them a little money or food, but that rarely happened. Even when help did come, it was a one-time thing and did not change their fate. Each servant had their own fears about the future. No one could afford to support another. Everyone lived on the brink of poverty. The system left no room for salvation. Thus, life on the street was a slow and painful death, stretched out over weeks or months. Each day took away a part of their health and hope. Old servants, accustomed to comfort and routine, could not adapt to this struggle. Their bodies could not withstand the strain. Their health deteriorated rapidly, and they soon ended up in a hospital for the poor or simply died of hunger and cold. Help came too late or not at all. These people disappeared unnoticed by the city. Victorian London continued to live, oblivious to their demise. Against the backdrop of general indifference, there was a small but important layer of self-organization and mutual aid among the servants themselves. Servants, especially those in high positions with stable incomes, realized that their own future could be just as bleak. This fear of poverty and old age stimulated the creation of small societies and mutual aid funds. These societies were usually formed on a professional basis. There were societies to help butlers, governesses, or cooks. Membership was voluntary and required regular, albeit small, contributions. The idea was simple: to create a collective financial cushion to help those in need. In the event of illness, dismissal, or old age, a member of the society could count on a small, one-time allowance, or in the most fortunate cases, a small annual payment. This was not enough for a full life, but it was enough to avoid a workhouse or pay for a bed in a cheap boarding house. The allowance gave a person time to catch their breath and try to find another way out. These funds also sometimes paid for their members to live in private, modest shelters, which were better than workhouses. The shelters were small but clean, and there was no hard labor. For old servants, this was an ideal solution that allowed them to retain what dignity they had left and spend their last years in peace. The employers themselves sometimes encouraged the creation of such societies, seeing it as a way to relieve themselves of responsibility for the future of their employees. Some gentlemen even made small donations to their servants' funds to enhance their reputation and convince the public of their benevolence. It was a profitable charity. However, these societies were not very effective due to low membership fees and the huge number of people in need. Funds were quickly depleted and benefits were often paid late or reduced. They were a symbol of solidarity but could not fully replace the state social security system. The most important thing in these societies was psychological support. Servants, united by a common fear and a common experience, felt less alone. They could exchange information about job vacancies, share advice, and help each other. It was not just financial insurance, but emotional insurance. Mutual aid was the servant's last line of defense against the cruelty of the system. It showed that even in conditions of total exploitation, people retained their capacity for empathy and compassion. These small funds were beacons of humanity in the dark Victorian sea. In the Victorian hiring system, letters of recommendation played the role of judge and jury, and for an old or sick servant, their absence or negative nature became an insurmountable obstacle. Reputation was everything, and one misstep could wipe out decades of impeccable service. It was reputation that determined whether a dismissed servant would struggle to survive or get a second chance. Recommendations were issued exclusively by former employers and contained not only information about the quality of work, but also about the moral character of the servant. Honesty, sobriety, decency, humility, all these qualities had to be confirmed. If there was even the slightest doubt or ambiguity in the letter, the servant was under suspicion. It was very difficult for a servant who had been dismissed due to illness to obtain a good recommendation. Employers unwilling to take responsibility for his poor health could write an evasive letter mentioning reduced working capacity or inability to keep up. Such wording was a red flag for potential employers. It was even worse if the employer hinted at alcoholism or laziness. In the Victorian era, illness was often associated with moral turpitude. A servant who could not cope with the work could be accused of indiscipline, which made him an outcast in the labor market. A negative recommendation was tantamount to a lifetime ban from the profession. Young servants with little experience often had no references at all. They were forced to start at the bottom, doing menial work where the requirements were minimal. But for an older person, starting from scratch was physically impossible. They could not compete with young people and had no documentary evidence of their merits. Some servants tried to forge letters of recommendation, but this was extremely risky. Employers often contacted each other to verify the authenticity of the documents. If the forgery was discovered, it led to complete ostracism and possibly even prosecution. The risk was too great for desperate people. Servants who were dismissed due to old age often received honorary recommendations, praising their many years of loyalty. But these letters were useless when looking for a new job. They served only to ease the conscience of the masters and give the servant a nice piece of paper that could not feed them. No one wanted to hire loyalty that was incapable of physical labor. Reputation and references were not just a formality, but the foundation of the Victorian social system. For servants, they were their only capital, and to lose that capital meant to lose everything. It was a cruel and ruthless system that did not forgive weakness or old age. The fate of old and sick servants, although hidden from the eyes of the general public, could not remain completely invisible. Gradually, towards the end of the Victorian era, public attitudes towards this issue began to change. Accumulated evidence of the cruelty of workhouses and the indifference of employers began to seep into the press, causing slow but growing discontent. Articles began to appear in the press recounting the tragic fates of dismissed servants. Journalists and writers, many of whom came from poor backgrounds themselves, began to raise the issue of the social responsibility of the rich. It was a quiet but important information war against the hypocrisy of Victorian charity. In response to this criticism, larger and more organized charitable foundations began to appear. Funds for dignified old age, or help for widowed maids, collected significant donations and were able to provide more systematic assistance. These organizations no longer simply gave one-time handouts, but sought to create small pensions or pay for accommodation in private boarding houses. Particular attention was paid to servants who were dismissed due to serious injuries sustained at work. If a maid fell down the stairs or a cook suffered a serious burn, public opinion tended to be that the employer should bear at least minimal responsibility for this. These were the first seeds of the idea of compensation for industrial injuries. The emergence of these funds and the change in public opinion, although not solving the problem completely, put pressure on employers. Some of them became more cautious about dismissing old servants, offering them small annual allowances, or allowing them to live in a small outbuilding on the estate. This was done more to maintain their reputation than out of genuine kindness. An important step was the creation of the first government initiatives aimed at combating poverty in general. Although these laws were aimed at all poor people, they indirectly improved the situation of former servants. Gradually, workhouses began to soften their regime, and medical care became more accessible. Nevertheless, the Victorian era ended without solving the problem of social insecurity for servants. Their future remained uncertain and depended on mercy and luck. Systemic changes that would guarantee the right to retirement and medical care did not occur until the following century. Ultimately, the fate of the old servants became a symbol of the dark side of the era. They were an invisible army that built Victorian prosperity, but were thrown onto the scrap heap of history as soon as they ceased to be useful. Their tragedy was not their poverty, but the utter oblivion to which they were consigned by the society they served. We have examined in detail the tragic and disenfranchised fate of Victorian servants who, in old age or illness, found themselves on the margins of life. They went through a cruel journey from many years of loyal service to rejection, vagrancy, the horrors of workhouses, or faceless hospitals for the poor. Their stories became a grim confirmation that in an era of prosperity, human life was valued only as a commodity. We learned about the duplicity of the Victorian mansion, the signs of impending dismissal, the unreliability of personal savings, and the rare oases of hope in the form of homes for elderly servants created through private donations. The most frightening thing is that for most, this path ended in a loss of dignity and complete isolation. They were invisible victims of a social order that valued appearances more than human life. Which aspect of the fate of old servants discussed here seems most egregious and unjust to you? Was it the complete abandonment of responsibility by their employers, or the humiliating system of workhouses? Share your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new, in-depth research into the hidden pages of history.